Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for joining Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. Our webinar this afternoon identifies a number of aspects of successful transmission expansion in PJM and why that matters now more than ever. To successfully plan for the big picture, we must build transmission not just to address immediate reliability needs, but to anticipate future demand, integrate new energy resources, and make smart investments that benefit customers across the states. PJM Interconnection recently took a major step in this direction by approving a $6.7 billion regional transmission expansion plan, including $4.6 billion for a high voltage transmission backbone. This is a bold and necessary investment to meet the nearly 30 gigawatts of new load expected in the region over the next 5 years, while lowering costs and strengthening reliability. Our panelists today will break down the drivers behind this breakthrough, the stakes for customers, and the road ahead for transmission development in PJM and beyond. We are fortunate today to be joined by sort of a motley crew of different interests throughout PJM, but all dedicated to the premise that building out transmission is needed in the best way to serve customers. With that, I will pass it over to Commissioner Richard.
Well, thank you, Christina. And also I want to thank the Americans for a Clean Energy Grid for this opportunity to be a part of your webinar and really discuss this critically important topic to not only the 14 PJM states, but indeed nationally. I would start by saying it's often said that what we're doing is about keeping the lights on, which is critically important. But I would argue that our job is much bigger and more complicated than just that. It's about delivering essential energy services affordably, equitably, reliably, and sustainably. And I did deliberately begin with affordability and equity because I'm particularly concerned right now as a state commissioner that the energy burdens are not just straining our ratepayers' budgets, our citizens' budgets, but they're actually depriving many of our citizens of these essential services. And I believe it's more important than ever that we remember why we're here and who we are serving. I was interested to learn that this is not just a concern here in PJM's footprint, but nationally when I read that the Southwest Power Pool, SPP, has initiated a proceeding on affordability, noting that FERC has placed affordability on par with reliability. Sustainability, as the sponsoring organization's name, Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, communicates, supporting the clean energy transition is also an imperative, and it is a requirement in many of our states. This all leads to our discussion today on how we can successfully build out the electric grid cost effectively with the necessary public support to achieve affordability, reliability, and sustainability to support electrification and the growth that Christina mentioned just a bit ago at the top of the discussion. Our topic today is how can taking an holistic approach be an effective strategy to achieve cost-effective, market-based solutions that considers generation, the distribution system, non-wires, and new grid-enhancing and alternative transmission technologies, along with transmission. So I'm excited we have a very outstanding panel today, and I believe can educate us and provide some great insights on this topic. So let me quickly introduce our panelists so we can begin our discussion. First, we have Tim Burtis from PJM. Tim is the lead strategist within the government policy department at PJM Interconnection. He assists in outreach and strategy development for state government engagement, focusing on policy assessment, market design, and transmission planning. He is responsible for PJM's engagement with the organization of PJM states. Tom Rutigliano from the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC. Tom works to ensure our wholesale power grid supports a clean energy future. He advocates with grid operators and before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for fair treatment of resources and against hidden subsidies for fossil fuels. His regional focus is the PJM Interconnection, covering the Mid-Atlantic and parts of the Midwest. And finally, we have Dale Arnold from the Ohio Farm Bureau. Dale is Director of the Energy, Utility, and Local Government Policy for the OFBF. For close to 4 decades, he has managed technical assistant projects addressing energy generation, transmission, and distribution issues. Dale works with utilities, energy service providers, regulators, local governments, and community stakeholders to identify and include quality of life benefits in stipulations on power siting proceedings at state and federal levels. Dale has authored the Farm Bureau policy papers advocating a diversified energy portfolio using domestic fossil resources, renewable and nuclear technologies. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. And I'm going to start with Tom and Dale. I'd like to begin with you both. Why is building out the grid important to your organization? And what does taking an holistic approach mean to you both?
Okay. Tom, you can go ahead. Please go first, Tom.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Commissioner. So building out the grid first and foremost is important to us because we need to upgrade the power grid to support large-scale integration of clean energy. That's both at the local level to support the rapid interconnection of the large amounts of new resources we need, and then regionally and nationally because reliability in a high renewables grid comes from being able to ship power long distances when needed. Right? We can envision a world where Midwest wind and Southeast sun both play major roles in keeping PJM reliable. So that's the big picture vision. Holistic planning means basically undoing all the silos that we found ourselves in. Right? PJM needs to think about resource adequacy and transmission planning in the same breath. PJM needs to think about load growth and new entry of supply resources. And probably hardest, we need to move from just thinking about the technical needs of the grid to looking at both the technical needs of the grid and the communities and land where the transmission is going to be built.
Thank you. Dale.
Great. Building on what Tom has said, and that was great, Tom. I appreciate that. Welcome to my world. It's interesting. A holistic approach is absolutely huge. And I just need to say this. There are some communities I work with in Eastern Ohio where you've had coal mining, oil and gas exploration, power generation. Those folks there, part and parcel, are understanding and know about energy development and have known that for over a century. Whenever they see new projects, the question is, okay, where is the table? Who are we going to sit down with? How are we going to collaboratively work on processes and systems? That's Eastern Ohio and many areas in the Appalachian Plateau. Western Ohio and points further west, where you don't have that, the collective consciousness is much different. For many of those folks, when you're taking a look at transmission line capacity or upgrades or a power generation facility coming in, it's a once in a generational event, and their collective consciousness is much different. We need to work on, as part of power siting for a number of things, those particular issues. I think basically it's anywhere between 50 and 60% of power siting. The technical work basically is done with regard to placement of a facility. The aspects with regard to energy delivery and things are there. But the other 60% are basically community perceptions, quality of life, being able to be effective neighbors, creating partnerships is absolutely huge. When I do meetings in those areas, the first thing I show them literally is a slide, is a map of the whole PJM system from the Carolinas to Chicago. And I say, this is local electricity, not your county, not your corner of your state, not only your own state. It's a 14-state network, power generation facilities, transmission facilities, your needs for electricity. And I'm working with farmers who, since the 1970s, a 400% increase in power generation requirements on the farm, new types of businesses coming in, homes. We all need this power and generation. We all need this infrastructure, and we all need to be at the table to discuss and plan how is it going to be here, how it's going to benefit our community. Is this a wise investment? Many people are finding that out, because for every dollar an energy service provider takes a look at investing in proper community planning and outreach, it saves them $35 in litigation in as little as 18 months. That's an important part of this particular issue going forward too. Welcome to power siting in the 21st century.
Thanks, Dale. So Tim, if you can pick up there, ultimately, we all look to PJM to keep the lights on. Can you give us an overview and walk us through the key components of PJM's RTEP plan announced earlier this year? What were some of the driving forces behind the decision to move forward with such a large program expansion plan? And were there holistic approach considerations, I should say, that went into the plan?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate the question. And I also appreciate the time with everybody here today and the invitation. So, taking a step back real quickly to then get to the heart of your question. Over about the last 20 or so years, PJM put out its first regional transmission expansion plan back in 2001. And we've always taken what is really known as like a deterministic approach to transmission planning. And that deterministic approach is one where there's really little randomness in what is the future state of the system, and there's high predictability with what that future state of the system is. So a generator wants to retire, we take action when we get a notice on that retirement. Load is causing a thermal violation. Well, we're going to plan for that when we see that sort of occurrence really come on in the time frame that we need to fix the problem in. Or a generator wants to come onto the system once its agreements are in place and its contract effectively is in place for the network upgrades to come online, then we're going to bake it into the model and everything else will build off of that. So there's history as to why the deterministic approach was really taken. A lot of that has to do with trying to minimize overall costs and reduce variability that could exist with having different assumptions related to what would be more of a probabilistic approach. I think when you look back at, call it the 2010s, with the Marcellus Shale play. Look, up until the 1950s, or going back to the 1950s, 1960s, the flows in the PJM system were west to east. It was the Alleghenies over to the I-95 load centers. And so, a deterministic approach for the incorporation of something like Marcellus Shale and what ended up being east to west transfers was actually accommodated pretty well. It had minimal reliability must-run arrangements for existing generators. I would say modest baseline transmission upgrades, and few, if any, stranded assets in terms of transmission development. All of that said, going forward, there's both a need and a desire for more of a probabilistic approach, which is one that can scientifically try to capture some randomness that we need to do to incorporate and better incorporate the holistic aspects that you're speaking about, Commissioner Richard, as well as Tom and Dale. And so I think being able to move forward to something that incorporates more of a probabilistic approach will allow us really to take a look at a horizon outside of the 5-year timeframe where PJM's near-term RTEP really looks at to drive and dictate projects, to see how we can sort of get ahead of some of those aspects. To your question specifically, Commissioner Richard, at the outset, this latest RTEP that was incorporated, it looked really at a 5-year window of what it was that we saw at that point in time. We studied out to 15 years. We even did a little bit of an extra analysis on the 8-year time frame to see the durability of some of those projects. But all in all, again, it's a deterministic approach that tries to look at the 5-year horizon. And I think we'll get into a little bit more about how getting to that probabilistic approach will bring in more holism to the process.
Okay. And were there any particular drivers that were of concern to PJM that maybe, again, given the size really and the number of projects that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, great question. Thank you. I think the rapid load growth, obviously, that we're observing, obviously in the PJM region, generally speaking, in the United States as well. Obviously, that is putting a lot of pressure on the short term, and trying to get ahead of that, I think, will help improve some of those situations. But that's 100% one example of this latest RTEP, where you have those closer to immediate need projects beginning to emerge. I think there's a higher reliance on some generators going away that could present critical components on the system that would have a lot of transmission build, which I'm sure we'll talk about as well. So definitely work their way into the latest RTEP, and I look forward to talking about how we can go forward with it.
Perfect. Good. Before we move on, does either Tom or Dale, do you have any comments or anything you want to raise about the RTEP, the current RTEP that is before us, that was recently proposed?
Yeah. I can say this because I really appreciate what Tim is saying and interesting. I've had the opportunity to work with, read the technical documents, see a number of things. Basically, I really commend PJM on the work that they're doing. But it's interesting too, related basically to the subject we have here. I can see work with Tim and PJM are looking at a number of technical aspects. Those technical aspects are all basically focused on, and they're doing an extremely good job with what you're seeing with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, with the responsibilities they have been given with regard to transmission planning. The rules to regulations process basically do that. We also need to take a look at and working with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, we also need to take a look at the other holistic things that we're talking about here. The community need, the process. It's interesting, FERC is also taking a look at that. And consequently, you have the Office of Public Participation that they're having to help folks get involved with this particular process that we're talking about here. And it's like, when I get into a room with our friends from PJM, this is what they're bringing in, the technical aspects. This is what the utilities are bringing in, basically the economic aspects. This is what the community stakeholders are bringing in, or the community aspects. We all have views and we all need to collaborate, work on those, put those together when we put these plans together in place. And having an effective strategy and having FERC take a look at that as they're putting these plans and these rules and regulations that we're all working on together with regard to that is something they need to think about in the future. But thanks, Mr. Richard. Tom, I'll send to you.
Yeah, thanks. I think the astonishing thing about the RTEP is just how quickly it happened and how much it's really grappling with these fast emerging problems. And I think that's a great reminder that, PJM can be nimble when the sense of urgency and clarity of purpose is there, which is something we should keep in mind, because in other more contentious transmission arenas, they're still figuring out who sits where at the table in the time it took RTEP to come up with $6 billion of transmission. The other big takeaway I have from it is that we're going to need to take another look at who pays for transmission. We're entering a world where the load side drivers of transmission are individual, very large loads, and arguably the benefits of those flow to particular states. It's not organic system growth anymore. And so I think a lot of states that aren't hosting the data centers that drive these needs are going to have some real hard questions to ask about why they should be paying for transmission that arguably is supporting other states' economic policies.
Yeah, and just following up on that, Tom, you talked also about how the RTEP process may be an opportunity to help address other holistic needs, such as the interconnection process. Did you have anything specific on that issue?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking that one. There was an often missed little bit of FERC's big transmission order, Order 1920, told the RTOs that they should look at things that have been blocking interconnection and consider rolling that into their regional planning. And I think PJM should go beyond the letter and really embrace the spirit of that when they look at their queues over the last number of years, what's been emerging as transmission needs that if they were built would really unblock some of these interconnection things and get them done proactively in RTEP. As always, we'll argue who pays for this, the public the way it is now, or do we kind of roll some of those costs forward to generators? But by taking the big upgrades we need to move interconnection forward and dealing with them in the relatively rapid RTEP cycle, I think we can ease the new entry problem that is really the base of so much of what's going on in PJM now.
Great, thank you, Tom. Dale, I'd like to address this question, let you start. And that is, in your work, you've identified community engagement as an important element of being successful in building out much needed transmission projects. Can you talk just a little more about this and how taking holistic approaches can help with community engagement?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm working on a number of those right now with folks, is that being able to see the need. A lot of folks at this particular level, as I said before, when I show them a map of PJM and say this is local electricity, for many of those folks, it's the first time they've had the opportunity to exercise their responsibility to be involved in this type of planning, understanding that electricity basically, and you're going to be getting generation from a number of resources, many of them intrastate and interstate. You're going to need this particular technology going forward. And it's almost like this technology is not being built for one particular large industrial customer. It's being built for all of us, because when you take a look at the mission of PJM, when you take a look at the position of FERC, when you take a look at your energy needs going forward, you are going to be needing this type of transmission. You are going to be needing this to fit the needs for your energy supply. And the question becomes this: are you going to be at the table to talk about and plan to ensure that your needs are there and advocate your position? Or are you going to take the risk that if you have a brownout or a blackout, are you able to answer and take a look at that? Because those are coming. And I say energy development is not a popularity contest. When you're faced, or when you have the opportunity to take a look at new infrastructure coming in, you need to work with regard to that. The focus of having yard signs and a petition saying, no, I don't want this, is not going to work. You need to understand why you need that. You need to have it made perfectly clear to you why you are a stakeholder in this process. Because if energy development becomes a popularity contest, we'll all be sitting in the cold and in the dark. That's part of this particular process here. Tom, Tim, back to you, Mr. Richard, but that's just part of it.
Yeah, and I did want to ask both Tom and Tim about community engagement and taking a holistic approach. What do you have any comments on, again, the community engagement part of being successful at building needed transmission?
Tom,
Yeah.
did you want to go first?
As you like. Yeah, sure. It seems it's vital, right? Community engagement. Without that, you can't get transmission built. PJM over the years has seen a number of big projects flounder on that. PJM, I think, for pretty good reasons, has tried to stay out of that. PJM kind of looks at the technical needs and, basically says the siting concerns of the developer's problem, which, just from a democratic perspective, that makes sense, right? A bunch of technocrats in Valley Forge are not the right people to solve that problem. That really should belong to state governments. But unfortunately, that's really resulted instead in nobody dealing with the problem. And you see it time and time again that because there isn't engagement with the communities the way Dale was saying from the very beginning, before you've even got lines in mind, and that community support or resistance and education all need to be part of this process, from day one. And so that needs to happen. I'm pretty sure PJM doesn't want to do it, and I'm not sure if they're the right people to do it, but we need some way of PJM working with our democratic institutions to make that happen.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll I agree with what was said, but I'll try to offer a little bit of a different angle on this, which is, so when we evaluate projects, both today and going off into the future with 1920 implementation, first and foremost, we want to look for brownfields. So where can we reconductor a line as opposed to building a brand new line? Where are existing right-of-ways that are being proposed? They typically obviously have a better likelihood of success, as well as, to the extent we don't get a specific route, that's part of the CPCN proceeding and the developer, as Tom noted, but we do get like a whatever they say in on the Weather Channel for hurricanes, like a cone of reasonableness or something like that, right? So we have some range where it's specifically going to go, and we use that to try to identify, are there any environmentally sensitive areas that would put, say, this project in a higher likelihood of that project. All of those, I think, are fine for the process as it goes forward. But as Tom noted, that's not 100% success for siting of these lines. A couple of things. One is interstate lines. It's very reasonable for a state to say, why would I give a CPCN to line A when it's going across and really benefiting people in line B, and I have to deal with the local needs and things like that. So I think that's just a reasonable situation that we find ourselves in with state lines. The other thing I think, and this is pivoting more toward 1920 and what can be done in the future, is how can we elicit okay zones, for lack of a better phrase. In Illinois, you have what is called the REAP, where they're looking to develop, effectively like heat maps for, generally speaking, these are good locations for generation to kind of locate. And that's instructive for PJM from the perspective of at least, we know this geographic location may be better for oncoming generation than, say, this other location, which maybe there's an EJ community in that other area. So I think trying to incorporate some of that information, and to the extent that we can elicit that from state partners or anything like that, where there are some zones that can be sort of identified as corridors for development for transmission purposes, I think that would be really helpful, but it's a continued conversation.
Thank you, Tim. And that kind of leads into a question I wanted to first address to Tom. And that really is about your involvement, Tom, in just in planning issues, actively, working on the interconnection process. And when I get to planning, really order 1000 for FERC order 1000, and now FERC order 1920. Can you talk about again how those planning orders fit into a more holistic approach, and how they can help us be successful in building important transmission projects?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll talk most about order 1920 because I think that's basically
Right.
where the action is right now.
Mhm.
In that it's attempting to mandate holistic planning, right? But, of course, the people implementing have to agree with the goals for it to be successful. But Order 1920 lays out that the RTOs essentially need to develop a vision for the future, right? And FERC has laid out pretty carefully a bunch of very legally defensible things they should do. And then it said, find the most cost-efficient ways of getting to that future, right? So I think the idea of doing holistic planning is pretty deeply baked into Order 1920. Although it runs into trouble around the margins, right? PJM is not ultimately responsible for the energy mix of the future. It has to some degree, accept that, although we do see that eroding. And, especially for PJM, where you've got states who are pretty sharply divided in their views of the future, that's going to make it very difficult for PJM to figure out what they're planning for. But I think the real gift of Order 1920, we know people are very opposed to it for a lot of kind of the specifics, and maybe it was overbearing. But if you look at it as laying very clearly that every transmission planner now has the opportunity to look 15 or 20 years out and do what they need to do for a reliable economic system, then I think it's nothing but opportunity there.
All right, thanks. Dale,
Yeah.
Tim,
Yeah.
maybe you, Dale,
Thanks,
would you like to comment on planning and how that helps?
Yes, that's great, because building on what Tom basically was
Yeah.
said, and I'd say this too, because with the folks we have here, we're just one part basically of the process and different things, and working with a number of folks. Commissioner Richard working basically with local utility commissions. There's a number of folks here who have a responsibility to do the planning, basically Tom has said, and being able to use the assets and the resources 1920's put out in front of us, being able to sit at the table, being able to take a look at this now, having the common sense and responsibilities that we can't wait to the last minute to make a decision. We need to take a look at these particular things now, and coming up with a dedicated plan that we can all collaborate on, all agree upon. Yes, this is what has to be done. Energy developers that work basically with PJM, the utilities, the immediate now time frame to keep the lights on and keep power supply there is always a 30-year time block. We have to have a number of folks that we work with in the community, Tom and I, also see things the same way. You need to take a look at what is your 30-year plan? What are going to be your projected needs? And you need to be part of this block approach, and you need to think out that far too. So I hope I've helped you some there, but Tim, back to you, my friend.
Yeah. And now, Tim, I'm sure you're well immersed in all of this, so maybe you don't want to get into too much of please talk about planning 1920 Order 1000, but if you have any comments about what you just heard from Tom and Dale.
Yeah, thank you. So I agree with both what I heard from both Tom and Dale, and I'm optimistic about 1920 and where we're going. We're in the compliance process at the moment here, so obviously some things can change with where we're presently situated at. But what I would sort of offer on the 1920 front, and this is echoing Tom's comment, is that it forces, for lack of a better word, holistic planning on the transmission side. We were working toward this, but I think 1920 obviously steers some ships in one singular direction, and it create some sort of standard baseline for what is to be considered. The challenge, whether we were to be in 1920 or not in 1920, when I go back to this word around probabilistic planning, is always around when we make a decision that's frankly based on an assumption, where is that line blurred between that assumption might be coming true versus maybe it won't come true and we end up in stranded assets. And at least from a PJM perspective, I know that that's something that gives us some heartburn because we don't want to be in the place of building a lot of transmission for assumptions that end up coming not to be. We're not the regulated entity in front of state commissions. We don't interact with utility commissions that way. We're not accountable to state utility commissions in that way that retail rate payers who are paying that those costs for such assumptions, we would bear the responsibility of then going back to the state commission. So that's one thing in all of this process, is trying to find out where's that sort of level of adequate line to make sure that we're incorporating enough of a forward look while at the same time making sure that we're not effectively spending other people's money, for lack of a better phrase. Last thing I'll just say as an example is generation retirement. I think one thing we could do is we could say, well, looking out onto the future, here's a whole host of generators that we think are going to retire. Would that be holistic planning? I suppose. But the better way to maybe go about doing that would be, of that population of generators that might retire, which are the ones that would have high cost issues if they were to retire, such that we would find ourselves in an immediate need process or an isolated set of transmission upgrades that are otherwise high cost. I think that's probably, at least at the outset here with 1920, where we want to find ourselves, is to, with something like that, find a surgical approach to it.
Thank you, Tim. And I will have to just for a second just publicly compliment you. Tim is very, very engaged with states and with OPSI and other entities, and he's very patient. He's been spending a lot of time on this issue, and at times, states, I know we have a lot of questions for you, but no, we do very much appreciate the work you're putting into this. And I have some, I guess, hope also that we're going to get to a good place as we kind of work through some of the differences I know we have right now. I'm going to let everybody know after this next round of questions, Chloe, I would like to go ahead and pause there and see if we have any questions from the audience. But let me start this next round of questions with really something that OPSI did, organization of PJM, in 2023. At that time, we formally sent a letter to PJM asking PJM to find solutions. And we quote, to elevate reliability and affordability and act, quote unquote, with a sense of urgency to address concerns over the reactive and costly immediate needs projects being proposed by PJM at the time to address load growth and deactivations. So as we know, we have a lot of the same, situation today, and in some cases it's just become more dire, and it also just points to needing a holistic approach as we look at even the nearer term planning, nearer term project consideration to ensure we're getting cost effectiveness, and we're also having at least some sense of what the future is going to look like, and trying to plan for that. So Tim, I'd like just to start with you, and some of this is just process, and we have had some good engagement with PJM and the PJM board on this, but could you just give us a status on the OPSI holistic approach request that was sent to you in 2023, and maybe some insights on how do we get to holistic solutions, how do we get them into the competitive selection process as early as possible, and I'm going to ask, maybe if I need to unbundle this, I will, but just, is this something that PJM can do on its own, or do we need a full stakeholder process? So I'm kind of interested in, again, some insights as to where PJM is right now on some of the things that, you've been engaged with OPSI on.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Commissioner. So I think there's a couple ways to attack the issue OPSI is arriving at. And you can attack it obviously with the immediate need. And just for everybody's background, the parlance of immediate need in PJM speak is a need has been identified, a generator is retiring, or sudden load increases happened such that there's going to be a thermal violation on the system within 3 years. That's the immediate need sort of trigger. And in and of itself, an immediate need project may not be more costly than if that same need was identified, say, in year 4 or 5, but it certainly provides less opportunity to kind of pair it with other solutions or needs that come up down the pike that might solve that problem. And so, as Commissioner Richard mentioned, OPSI said, how effectively do we get out of this immediate need kind of like situation, or minimize the amount of these immediate need projects because they tend to be costly. And so 2 ways of tackling it, on a timeline standpoint. One is kind of what we talked about here a little bit, which is work it from the back end. If you're doing more longer term planning, then by nature, you're sort of getting out ahead of some of these things. So 1920 is a process that'll do that. We've implemented capacity interconnection right transfer processes. So if a generator wants to retire, another generator can hop in and use those CIRs to come online. That should be something that helps address that issue. There's something else called surplus interconnection service that was put into place. And I'm sorry, the CIR transfer is still before the FERC at the moment here. All of that said, those are more so, how do you kind of try to prevent this idea of an immediate need transmission project happening in the first place? There's still the other outstanding question here with OPSI of, well, what happens when it does occur? What do you do about that? Inside the stakeholder process at the moment, the Maryland OPC and Illinois CUB have something percolating around about how to incorporate at least alternative technologies, which my understanding is that would just be your traditional GETs, but also perhaps battery storage when there's a deactivating generator, how that can manifest itself to solve the problem. So I think that's one angle there. The outstanding question is whether or not that is the totality of kind of what OPSI was looking for, or if when the immediate need hits, if there's is there a generation solution that we can go out and sort of procure and say, hey, we know you weren't looking to develop something, but if you could come on within 3 years, you would solve this as opposed to this transmission project. And I think that's the remaining question with OPSI to sort of explore.
Yeah, no, I thank you for covering that. And yes, we very much appreciate PJM acting on the CIR transfer and also the system surplus issue. I think that's going to be helpful. But some part of the letter really got into the distribution system. And are there ways we can be engaged as states with PJM to again look at the distribution system, things that we regulate, to be partners with PJM in trying to solve some of these immediate needs issues, so that when we look to developing transmission, they are kind of truly planning for the future.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I did forget that aspect from the letter. Yes, there is something there that can be done and sort of worked on, and something for us to sort of think about. I'm assuming the thought process there is perhaps something on like the distribution load response side. Can load response be put into place at certain times to maybe minimize immediate need transmission? Obviously some distribution system upgrades or something like that to that extent. So I think there is an opportunity there.
Good. Hopefully we can continue to work together to try to develop that, because again, I think that will get us to really being able to build the immediate transmission, the right transmission, and hopefully come up with cost-effective solutions for whatever is kind of the whatever we need to react to at that moment. So, but let me turn to Dale and Tom. Do you have any thoughts on again what was in that OPSI letter? And I should probably let the audience know that I believe Chloe, you are going to make that letter available. So if you don't know really what we're talking about, a chance to see what the organization of PJM states had proposed to discuss with PJM. But anyway, Tom or Dale?
Well, I could say this. I really appreciate the letter. And I remember when that letter was sent a couple of years ago, And it kind of reminds me of this. Back early in my career, and I've been here for about 40 years, but early in my career, I'd say the early to mid 1990s, I remember being in a meeting at Pittsburgh with a group of folks, about 25 to 30 of us, future casting and looking at things, exploring the 30-year time block. And we were talking about, this is what we're going to see with generation, old technology being retired, new technology coming in, transmission requirements, and also local distribution networks, technology and things that have to be incorporated. And it's interesting how those scenarios were put together, but every once in a while, there's another piece of the pie that no one thought about. And you're seeing that right now with artificial intelligence, data processing centers, large centralized demand loads that are technology today that weren't thought about then. As Tom was saying too, and Tim was saying, being flexible, also building those into the scenarios, a worst possible case scenario, if you do have a new technology coming in and you do have to immediately meet a load requirement, different things with regard to that. How is that going to be done? That needs to be part of that 30-year time block planning too. And I think also too, building on what Tim basically has said, is that we all need to think about, and this is kind of new, is, you know, this is the way we acted and worked together regulatory wise in the 20th century. It's now the 21st. We're going to have to sit together. We're going to have to collaborate, and we're going to have to expand basically our vision and different things. Or as Tom said at the beginning of his particular presentation today, remove those silos. We need to think more about being able to sit at that table, discussing things, and probably discussing things and scenarios and technologies and things that we haven't dealt with before, and being open to take a look and explore and look at those possibilities. Again, welcome to power siting in the 21st century.
Thank you. And Tom, anything on solving immediate needs with holistic solutions?
Sure, a few things. Just to the very specific immediate needs, the kind of the technical term. That's a bit of an exception to competition rules that's very favorable to incumbent owners, right? When a transmission project is designated immediate needs, the incumbent transmission owner gets to build in the rate base it without competition. So it's very attractive to them. And since Order 1000 came out, we've seen an increase in immediate needs that, you know, who knows what motives are, but arguably looks like people gaming that exception. So if you want to fix that, the simple answer is follow the money, right? Make sure that take away the financial incentive for immediate needs projects. Ensure that if there wasn't enough notice out there for those kinds of needs to be dealt with through regional planning, you see a lower ROI for the incumbent who invokes the immediate need exception. But that's a pretty specific, you know, transmission competition thing. I mean, the general problem that OPSI says, and I think they nailed it in the letter where they say it's the negative effects of siloed reactive planning, right? We need, as the system changes, especially as we're entering a time of really dramatic change, you need to be able to look not only at what generators we're retiring and what the transmission solutions are, but also how we're going to replace those generators, all as part of the same process. I mean, right now, retiring a power plant, dealing with the effects of that retirement, and building its replacements are three essentially disconnected processes, which, you know, frankly, is fairly absurd. I mean, part of that's jurisdictional, right? PJM has jurisdiction over the transmission system and states have jurisdiction over generation. But we need to get to a place that when a generator is retiring or we're seeing load growth, we know about that far enough in advance for PJM and states to work together on how we're going to deal with it, and to see what we've been calling seamless same-day transition from the retiring resource to the new one. If you don't do that, we're just going to stumble into expensive short-term reactive solutions over and over again, right? And especially for the states whose plan is to retire a lot of their fossil, they need a very clean path to replacing it with the new resources, probably storage, that are necessary to maintain reliability. And the current planning structures just don't give us that.
Right, thank you. And I would just take note that one of your sister organizations, Tom, Sierra Club, did do some work with the Brandon Shore Wagner closure and had come up with some ideas that were floated and discussed with PJM, again, on what could be done with transmission solutions and looking at distribution system and storage. So anyway, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. So, you know, I'm encouraged to hear that PJM is still open to working with OPSI on this. With that, I would just like to pause for a moment. Chloe, do we have some questions that we can take from the audience and get them engaged in this conversation?
Yes, we have a few. So I can go ahead and get started with this one from Claire Weiner, which asks, what is the potential for co-locating transmission along existing rights of way, including highways and railroads in PJM, to reduce siting and permitting conflicts and greenfield impacts?
Great. Tim, do you want to go ahead and lead us on that?
Yeah, so great question. Thank you, Commissioner. Great question, Claire. So, I mean, the proposals that kind of come to PJM are those that are given to us by the developers themselves. So the incentive is on them to try to find whether there's existing right-of-way, whether there's right-of-way they can lease from somebody else that might have that right-of-way, or, like in the case of Amtrak or something like that. So, when we start looking at the proposals that come before us, to the extent that those proposals are using existing right-of-way, they obviously are heavier weighted in the favorable side than a project that would be something without existing utilization.
Dale?
Yeah, I guess it's interesting. We talk about co-location of right-of-ways. Farm Bureau policy is basically we support with regard to that where it is feasible. It's interesting is here, and building upon what Tim has said, when you take a look at, and this might not be in the realm of PJM, but in FERC, if you want to do co-locating, what does that entail? Does that entail basically being able to go into that particular right-of-way, where it's structured within its width, to put additional infrastructure being right next to it, which means an extension basically of a 60-foot to 120-foot in different things, which might logistically work, might not. It has to be seen on each level. And it's interesting. It's an issue that needs to be explored. I'm sure PJM and Farm Bureau and others will want to be in on this and input on this, but this was a very interesting discussion. Our friends at FERC and other regulatory agencies need to be involved with too, as well as utility commissioners going forward.
And not much to add to Dale and Tim's point beyond, I guess, the obvious observation that the earlier on in the process we look at siting issues, the more we'll be able to make sure we properly look at all those benefits.
Great. Yeah, I would just comment too that just having time, sometimes immediate needs mean we're kind of almost rushing to get something in place because of the violation that Tim talked about. So with a holistic approach, we might be able to come up with some solutions to give us more time to better, I guess, consider existing rights of way, because sometimes it's the timing requirement that doesn't give us that opportunity to again look at the existing rights of way, and that is something that has come to my attention and why holistic planning could be helpful. So let's see, Chloe, you said you had a couple of questions.
Yeah, we can move on to this one from William Chambliss. Why is it PJM's responsibility to do resource planning as opposed to the states that comprise PJM?
Tim, you want to start that?
Yeah, sure. So I don't know that it is PJM's responsibility to do resource planning. And I think that comment probably came from another comment earlier in the discussion. Obviously, as part of at least 1920, from our perspective, we want to make sure that when we look out over the time horizon, as we see retiring generation, and to the extent we see increasing load, that the system is able to reliably deliver generation to meet the 1 in 10 loss of load expectation standard. And I think that's really where our responsibility from a resource planning, transmission planning standpoint, those two sort of Venn diagram over top of each other starts and ends. But in terms of what the resource mix is, what's provided to us, that I concur that it's not our responsibility.
Yeah.
Dale?
I say it's a very interesting question, and building upon what Tim has said, yes, PJM does need to be involved. You're taking a look at interstate transmission, other types of infrastructure. Yes, PJM needs to be involved. I can say this, working in Ohio, working with our Public Utilities Commission, we had the Resource Advisory Council for a number of years. I had the opportunity to be involved with regard to that. We met on a quarterly basis. We talked about a number of these particular issues, how they impact communities, the need for energy supply, new infrastructure coming in. Those particular discussions go in cycles. They go basically and are explored by a number of different government administrations. And I look forward basically to having that kind of council work basically done again on that level.
And if,
Tom?
you know what, yeah, I'll jump on that. I guess the real answer, I think, is that in a lot of ways we sort of stumbled into this situation. You know, PJM runs its capacity market, and because the landscape has been kind of smooth sailing for the last 20 years, right? Not a lot of load growth and lots of cheap new resources coming online. And that let us all succumb to the illusion that capacity markets are a substitute for resource adequacy planning. We're quickly learning now that they're not. And I would agree that states, I think, are going to need to step up their planning game and flex some muscles that they probably haven't used in about 2 generations. And so when I said earlier, I think you're probably reacting to me saying in transmission planning, we need to break down that silo between resource adequacy planning and transmission. States absolutely need to be at the wheel, right? States, especially the ones with ambitious energy plans, need to be coming to PJM with a resource adequacy vision. And then that needs to feed into PJM's planning.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, that's exactly how I would answer the question too. It's simply maybe our IRP muscles have atrophied because we haven't needed to use them for quite some time, and there was an expectation that the RPM, the reliability pricing model, would send the necessary signals, and the interconnection process would bring those resources online. But you know, I could point to the most recent Maryland legislative session. I think now we as a state realize we need to be more engaged and more attentive to our resource adequacy planning, and are taking the steps now to do so. Chloe, maybe I'll take another question if we have one from the audience.
Sure. We have one from Hassan Idris. How severely is market instability negatively impacting PJM's transmission planning with respect to recent capacity auction price spikes that have highlighted instability in PJM's market structures? How are the concerns about affordability and reliability being handled?
Yes, sorry, Commissioner.
Oh, please. No, I think it's appropriate for PJM to lead on that one.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah, thank you. So, you know, obviously the tightening supply dynamic that was observed in the last capacity auction that was executed back in July brought to light, you know, increasing demand, obviously decreasing supply, and therefore the increased pressure on prices. And as Commissioner Richard said at the outset, more so in the transmission space, because subject to the panel, you know, affordability concerns. And so at least in the near term, for the next 2 capacity auctions, one coming up here this summer and then one in December, there is a mechanism in place that places a cap on the price of capacity as well as a floor on the price of capacity for those 2 auctions. We are also in the midst of what's called a quadrennial review to sort of take a look at some of those inputs. That information is out in the public domain, but to get to your question there is some observation around some of the different market dynamics that are influencing the price to bring capacity onto the system here at the current moment in time. But for the interim, for the next 2 auctions, we do have that current proposal in place for the capacity market.
Yeah. Great. It's interesting, commodities, such a wonderful thing. As well as having that picture I had to show local electricity and using the PJM map, I work a lot with farmers, commodity intensive business. They work with corn, wheat, beans. And I showed them a technical analysis chart of those prices going up and down. I also show them the prices basically for electricity, natural gas, fuels, and capacity systems is a commodity basically too. Commodities, basically their prices are determined on supply, demand over time, calls, puts, collars, futures, contracts, indexed to a market, be it Chicago or New York, or basically something with regard to a capacity auction with PJM. helping folks at my level to understand that those are commodities and those prices are regulated, risk management things are done with regard to that, looking at trade arbitrage, looking at balancing, predicting going forward can be a complex and daunting process. That's another thing in education outreach. We need to bring people in to be able to understand, appreciate how the pricing and the risk management and the structures that are involved with regard to that are done, not only with corn, wheat, and beans, electricity, natural gas, and fuels, but also line capacity, as Tom and Tim were talking about.
Tom, anything to add?
I think the price spikes we've seen in capacity, I think they just underline that point that the capacity market isn't a substitute for planning. The economics, Econ 101 tells us, oh, the prices go up, we'll see more generation built and everything should work. But we've all seen the reality isn't that simple. The capacity market seems to work pretty well for retaining existing generation or competition at the margin, but it's not the right tool to get new generation built. And so, if we do see things moving in a direction where states are taking more responsibility for resource adequacy, we also need to rethink the capacity market, because pricing the commodity based on new entry when it can't drive new entry is just a windfall at consumers' expense, right? And we need to think, what would a capacity market look like that's based about its goals of retaining resources and making sure the resources you need can earn enough money to survive. I think you'd see a more stable, just differently calibrated market than if we kind of went down this road of where it's sort of a planning tool and sort of not.
Thank you for that. We're down to our last 3-4 minutes here. So why don't we just end with looking ahead, what kind of policies or regulatory changes do you think could help PJM and other regions accelerate development and successfully build the needed transmission for the future? And I'm kind of thinking in terms of, there has been some talk about enhancing RTO authority like PJM to give them more control, more authority, and perhaps even independent 205 rights over designing the system. Or maybe something like an independent transmission monitor. But do you have any thoughts on that? And Tom, I'll let you start this time.
Ooh, that's a big one. The underlying problem is political, and I don't know how to have a solution. When you've got states pulling PJM in 2 different directions and the federal government basically switching directions every 4 years, it's very hard to plan for the future in that environment. So I think we need somehow to find a way where we've got a clear vision of where we're going. If we don't do that, you're never going to be able to figure out the right way to get there.
Dale?
Yeah, I have to say the same thing with Tom. Having a clear vision about where we want to go is absolutely huge. And what people are finding out too is that we are all part of this particular discussion. It's not necessarily going to be done on a federal, state, or local level. But the more people that we have in the room, the more knowledge we have to advocate our positions, the more discussion we're taking a look at 30 years basically in advance on the timing block is going to help us. And we've never done that before. This is all literally unexplored territory in some way, shape, or form. Bringing those people in, discussing, saying, this is the problem we're seeing today. Where do we need to be 30 years from now? How are we going to get there? And what is going to be the plan is going to be huge. And that's a whole different way, basically, of looking and discussing things going forward. And I welcome basically working with all of you on those issues.
Tim, what does PJM need to holistically plan the grid of the future, the transmission system of the future?
Yeah, thank you. So I think going back to Tom's comment about variability, I think obviously establishing a long-term transmission planning process that can take a look at variable outcomes, but get ahead of them so that, as we talked about, immediate need projects as they emerge, sort of getting ahead of whether they emerge in the first place. But doing so in a way that can kind of minimize the risk of stranded assets based on assumptions, that otherwise we're putting into the process ourselves. And I think that's all part of the collaboration here and implementation of a long-term planning process.
Great, thank you. Tom, Dale, Tim, thank you so much for being a participant in this panel today. And I want to thank the Americans for a Clean Energy Grid for hosting it, and all of our audience for joining us today. So with that, Chloe, do you have any closing administrative remarks or anything you wanted to close us with?
No, thank you all so much for joining. If you're interested in watching this or sending it to a colleague, it will be recorded on our website later today. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye, everyone.